Have you ever considered what exactly it is that makes a statue such an amazing symbol of either oppression or heroism, depending on your perspective? This is something that I've been thinking about a lot as there have been a move to remove a number of these Confederate war memorials across the southern part of the United States. And a lot of people, I think rightfully so, look at this as being a revisionist way of looking at history and saying these monuments ought to stay there because this was history. This shows what happened, and these memorials were put there in place to remind people of what happened. Now, that is true to an extent. People make reference to the book 1984 and how history was constantly being rewritten, and that the only thing that was correct is what the party said was correct. And I think that is a valid warning. When you look and you see historical monuments being destroyed for no other reason than it doesn't fit with somebody's view of history. However, that's not necessarily the case. If you look at these war memorials that are being taken down, for the most part, these are statues of Confederate generals in their poses, which really remind me an awful lot of the statues of Joseph Stalin or Vladimir Lenin that were torn down at the end of the Soviet Union. You remember this? In 1991, there was this whole wave of statues that were torn down. I remember seeing these images and thinking, what an amazing point of history this was that we were watching happen. Now, of course, these statues had been erected in many places in countries where Stalin and Lenin had basically, they had their ideology invade and had been superimposed upon the locals there. And these statues were there to remind them who their new masters were. So it really wasn't that surprising to see these torn down. In fact, I found a picture while I was thinking about this, searching back to 1956. Do you remember the Hungarian uprising? In that, I found a photograph of the Hungarians destroying a statue of Stalin that had been erected in 1951 in Hungary. And as I'm sitting here looking at that picture and comparing it to the picture of the statues of Lenin being toppled in 1991 and comparing it to the statue of Saddam Hussein that was torn down by the Iraqis in 2003 after the American invasion there, and I'm looking at all of these and thinking to myself, now what is the difference between that and what had happened in Durham, North Carolina, earlier this week when protesters toppled the statue there? Is there really a difference? Because if you think there's a difference, you're going to need to really dig down deep into this, because it seems to me that it's the same issue. Who was it that erected these statues? They were governments, right? These were statues that were funded with taxpayer money. Therefore, these are expressions from the rulers telling the people, this is what you need to look up to. Now, whether this was done in many of these cases, the Civil War monuments were erected in the 1920s across the southern portion of the United States. This is 60 years after the Civil War, as a way to remind people down there what it was that had happened in the Civil War, in the sense of reminding them of the history of the Confederacy. And look, I'm not going to go into a lot. I've got some really good friends of mine who look at this as the War of Northern Aggression, which it was, and who think that slavery had very little to do with it, which, honestly, I don't think it had as much to do with it as our textbooks tell it did. I think it had more to do with economics and with freedom than it had to do with slavery. However, the very fact that slavery was allowed to continue in a country that considered itself free is disturbing to me. And the fact that we have people who consider themselves advocates of free speech who are criticizing those who are expressing free speech in a form of protest that involves the destruction of government statues, I don't think you know your history very well. I just want to throw that out there. If you can look at these examples that I gave you from 1956 in Hungary, from 1991 across the former Soviet Union, and from 2003 in Iraq, and if you can tell me what the difference is with those statues being toppled and the one that just happened in Durham earlier this week? Tell me. Send me an email, steve@radiofreespeech.com. Let's talk about it.